paid too much attention to the practical that I didn't give enough attention to the lecture exam. Yeah.
That's good. That's nice.
So this time I'm going to try not to that was kind of like a big deal. I made
You know what? This is just a small part.
Oh, get started.
have to study. Yeah. Well, I was just half an hour looking for something.
What day are you having a study?
Huh?
What day are you having a study?
What day am I having a stomach?
As a substitute teacher.
25th.
Somebody left their lunch bag here, so I put it on your desk.
Oh. Yeah, I checked. There's a hot pocket in there. Maybe I'll. Oh, someone give me beer inside or something. I'm joking. We're going to start the blood chapter, which is covered on lecture exam 5. The blood components can be seen by doing a blood draw, doing a light centrifugation, and you can spin the formed elements down, the more dense components of blood. And we can see the components or fractions of blood fractionated. And what we see on top is the liquid portion, the plasma. Just describe it as liquid. It's mostly water, but it's that kind of yellowish color. And then you have a very thin layer, it's about 1 millimeter thick. It's the buffy coat. It's white. Call that, well, it's white because it contains the leukocytes, as well as the platelets. Platelets are also known as the thrombocytes because they help create blood clots or a thrombus. You know, it's a very small proportion of blood, as you can see. I mean, it's less than 1%. So the top half, a little more than half, 55%, less than 1%, and the bottom 45% is the formed elements known as the erythrocytes. Okay. Erythro means red. The erythrocytes are the RBCs for short, the red blood cells. Leuco means white, so sometimes I call these the WBCs for short. And so the erythrocytes is something like 45% on average, and well, it's the RBCs that they bind and transport the O2, the oxygen. Okay, so those are the fractions of blood, and here's some more characteristics of blood on this slide. What we see is that the pH has a range of 735 to 745 because venous blood carried in the veins, has increased amounts, partial pressure. There's more carbon dioxide in it. Okay, so that's why arterial blood, a little more basic. Because let's remember that CO2, when you hydrate it with H2O, it can kind of like form the carbonic acid, H2CO3, which is a weak acid, which can dissociate into, I'm running out of room here, a hydrogen proton plus bicarb, HCO3, carries a negative charge. Well, anyways, because it's a weak acid, more CO2 content can make the blood in the veins a little more acidic. Other properties include the average blood volume in males and females. It's a little different because, well, on average, persons who weigh a little more can have a little more blood. However, pregnant moms can double their blood volume. This is showing you what happens if you have blood in the test tube and you siphon off the plasma. What happens is the clotting factors that are suspended in the plasma, they react with the charged particles of the glass tube and they form an intrinsic clot. So, serum is plasma without the clotting factors. You should know that. So I'll read that for you. Serum is plasma without clotting factors. So you can see that blood looks different when it's fractionated. Of course, blood circulates as whole blood. So when people use that term blood, and they refer to whole blood, it's the plasma with all the, what they call the formed elements. Now when they're all mixed together nicely and homogeneously, whole blood is described as a colloid suspension of the formed elements mixed and suspended in the plasma. Colloid suspension. It's kind of like when the oil and the vinegar separate in your salad dressing and you kind of shake it up before you pour it over your salad, right? It's kind of like that. Things can separate out. Well, anyways, let's talk about more functions of blood. And I won't give you any more board notes on this because for blood gases, I'll talk about that a little bit, but I talk about gas exchange primarily with the respiratory system. I mentioned pH, however, blood can regulate pH. I talk about that more in the renal chapter, kidneys. In terms of superficial deep veins, I mean, blood can dissipate heat to the environment if you shunt more blood to the superficial veins, the ones right underneath your skin. I think I've mentioned that before. And protection, the white blood cells. We'll talk more about how to identify them and a good overview of their function in the blood chapter. However, there's a whole chapter dedicated to immunity. And so I'll focus more on their function there in the immunity chapter. All right. One of the key functions of blood I want to mention now is where blood picks up O2. It's at the pulmonary capillaries. That's what you see from this graph here. So you're studying these different kinds of blood vessels. You pick up O2 at lung capillaries. You drop it off at systemic capillaries. Now when I say blood picks it up, the fraction of blood we're talking about are the red blood cells. And there's a molecule called hemoglobin. Hemo, think blood, hemoglobin. The protein has a globular structure. Abbreviated HB. This is in the RBCs. It binds O2. It picks it up in the pulmonary capillaries. It drops it off in the systemic capillaries, and it's all principles of diffusion, high to low. Okay, pick it up, drop it out, that's very simple. I put a picture of a capillary there, because I mentioned it during capillary exchange in that part of the lecture for blood vessels. Here's a nice figure showing you the components of plasma formed elements. And I think what's remarkable is that whole blood only represents 8% of all the body fluids, of all the body weight. It's a very small proportion. It's only 5 liters. Sounds about right. However much 5 liters weighs, it's probably about 8% of your body weight. So blood plasma is mostly water. What you see there in that breakdown is that plasma, about 91.5% good old H2O. There are some things floating in it, soluble in it, like albumins. Albumins are proteins that provide the blood colloid osmotic pressure. BCOP, blood colloid osmotic pressure. I'll just give you the abbreviation. I talked about that before. That helps draw fluids, retain fluids to keep blood pressure up. And then they list fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is the soluble form of clotting factor number 1, Roman numeral 1. And if you have a damaged blood vessel and you need to stop the bleeding, fibrinogen can come out of solution and form an insoluble fibrin and create all these like fibrin threads. It creates like this mesh fisherman's net that catches blood cells. Threads. And then all the blood flows, is leaking, and it gets caught into this fisherman's net, and that forms a clot until the vessel walls can heal. So these little red things I'm drawing symbolize blood cells being trapped in your fibrin threads. That's a blood clot. Well, anyways, fibrinogen, I talk about blood coagulation. Probably talk about that next week. The other things listed under plasma, electrolytes, nutrients, gases, I'll talk about that later. The formed elements are listed here. I already mentioned platelets and red blood cells. I did not mention how the white blood cells have these different varieties. So let me list these. Now the white blood cells, WBCs, can be categorized by the granules contained in the cytoplasm. Either you have them or you don't. If they're absent, that's a granule, white blood cells. White blood cells that don't have these granules are the monocytes and the lymphocytes. Agranular. The granular ones, granules contain defensive molecules. Those include neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. I'll go over their functions later. I just want to kind of let you know how histologists classify them. How they're listed on this slide is in order of prevalence. Neutrophils, the most prevalent of the white blood cells, and on down. Basophils are the rarest. So when you kind of study the histology, usually you just get a drop of blood, you put it on the slide, and you call it a blood smear slide. You only notice the formed elements. You don't see any plasma components. And you have to kind of search around. It's like a 1,000 to 1 ratio. A sea of red blood cells, and every once in a while you spot a purplish, stained white blood cell. And so just remember, never let monkeys eat bananas in order of prevalence. Neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, eosinophils, basophils, you never see them. They're hard to find. Maybe on our entire collection, you might have one slide that has one. So don't worry about finding that, you won't. Now, what I want to focus on now is the physiology behind how they're formed. After all, they call them the formed elements. So we do spend time talking about that. The three categories are, again, red blood cell, white blood cell, platelet. Those are the three. I'll talk about the formation of red blood cells first, and it happens in the bone marrow. Although I don't have a picture of the bone marrow, but the process of red blood cell formation, just call it erythropoiesis. Erythro means red. All formed elements happen, this happens in the bone marrow. I should probably write that down. All blood cells, formed elements, and they're not true cells, but that's why they're called formed elements. You can think of them as blood cells. Formed, quote unquote, right? Because they call them the formed elements. In the red marrow, you have red marrow in the sternum, the flat cranial bones, I'll just put cranium, proximal femur, iliac bone. Now, all cells are derived from, as you can see from this figure on the far left, the hemocytoblast. Okay? All blood cells formed in the red marrow form from the hemocytoblast, whether it be red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. If you're going to be committed to the red blood cell pathway, erythropoietin is essential to go down the red blood cell pathway. Okay, that's what I have on the slide. So let me write that down. EPO is essential. You can't make red blood cells without it. EPO comes from the kidney. I never write it out. I always just call it EPO, but the full name, erythropoietin. It's a hormone. It's from the kidney. And it targets the bone marrow, and it targets these hemocytoblast cells. So once you get that going, you have that cell called the prourethroblast committed cell. You're on your way. Because the prourethroblast will take you to what's called the developmental pathway of the red blood cell, divided into phases. So we'll go phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1, they call ribosome synthesis. Now, as I get into the details here, let's look at the big picture. Look from left to right. As a cell develops into an RBC, does it get larger or smaller? Smaller. It decreases in size, right? That's one generality. Let's think about this. Because these are blood cells, and they have to flow through the smallest blood vessels, which are the capillaries, they got to be pretty small. Okay? So as they develop, they eject the organelles that they don't need. So that's why you see this decrease in size. Well, it starts off with phase 1. The primary job of the RBCs is to transport O2. So you have to make a lot of hemoglobin. So to get ready to synthesize hemoglobin, you need the rRNA. That's what ribosomes are, right? The rRNA. So cells that are synthesizing the rRNA are called the erythroblasts. The erythroblast cells are synthesizing the rRNA, and the reason you can tell it's a erythroblast is when you dye it, it takes up a stain that it presents as, we call it basophilia. Erythroblasts baso, that represents that purplish, bluish color, whatever you want to call it. Cells that take up that stain, it means they're synthesizing the rRNA. Okay, so you get to phase 2, cells are getting smaller. That is the hemoglobin accumulation phase. HB accumulation. So that's just it. The rRNA content decreases, hemoglobin increases, and the cell will then preferentially take up it'll present as eosinophilia. And you call the cells normoblasts. Eosinophilia. That's a red color. So that's how you tell one from the other on a histology slide of the bone marrow. So, once you've accumulated enough hemoglobin to accomplish your function in the blood, you can eject the last thing you don't need, which is the nuke. Call it phase 3. Nuke ejected. And once it's ejected, call the cell a reticulocyte. Then enter circulation. Via the sinusoidal capillaries. Those are the leakiest ones. Sinusoidal capillaries. Those are the capillaries of the bone marrow. And at that point, you're a full-on RBC, a mature RBC. Reticulocytes haven't quite got that semi-donut configuration yet. You actually may see reticulocytes on a blood smear slide, although you typically don't see them. Maybe if there's a slow bleeding ulcer or something and you're constantly losing blood and you constantly have to replace it, you might see more of those. It means the bone marrow is trying to compensate for this blood loss. Well, anyways, this whole process requires EPO, but also note it requires iron and B12. Okay, I won't write it on the board, but it's on the slide there. You should know that. And also know that the process takes about 3 days. So the same process shown. Basophilic cell, urethroblast shown here. It's got a lot of RNA, phase 1. And as it declines and hemoglobin then increases, that's phase 2. Phase 3, eject, right? And then reticulocyte, and then day 3, enter the blood. That is the erythrocytes. I'll talk a little bit more about their characteristics. They pick up O2 and they're dedicated for transporting respiratory gases. I have some other points here too. Okay. The blood gases that they transport are O2 as well as CO2. When hemoglobin is bound to O2, you would call that oxyhemoglobin. Actually, that's one word. It's oxy. You pick it up at the lungs. Then you drop it off at the tissues. And at the tissues, you're accumulating CO2. So CO2 kind of gets on the bus. O2 gets off, hemoglobin, CO2 gets on. That way the venous blood can transport it to the lungs and you can breathe it off. So think of CO2 as a waste product. Call that carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin of the RBC, it transports the respiratory gases. The biconcave shape and all those other points, it's better seen on this slide here, where they show you the cross-sectional view of what a biconcave shape is. Concave means curved in. So it's curved in on both sides, hence biconcave. And then so on anywhere within the cell, there are relatively short distance to the cell surface for easier gas exchange. And also, the average diameter is 7.2 to 8.4 microns. So that should be enough to squeeze through the capillary beds single file. And because you're kind of flattened like pancakes, pancakes aren't truly biconcave, but I guess pancake is closer than beach ball. Most cells are round or square. So these can stack a lot easier and file through single file. And because you're single file, it's like all of them are doing the gas exchange. Okay. That's the average diameter. Below refers to the ability to stack, ability of RBCs to stack, file through capillaries, how do you want to say it? Let's see here. All right, so I want to show you a slide of hemoglobin. And think of RBCs as just being bags of hemoglobin. They don't have anything else. I mean, literally, they don't even have a nucleus. But they have these. Hemoglobin is a tetramer. So 4 parts, 2 alpha, 2 beta chains. They're all linked together. HB, tetramer, 2 alpha, 2 beta chains, each of which contains an iron-containing heme pigment. Iron containing heme. So that's where the O2 binds. So, how many molecules of O2 can one molecule of hemoglobin bind? 4, right? Now, if you look at the top there, if one RBC has 280 million hemoglobin molecules, that's like over 1 billion molecules of O2. So if you kind of like want to like go through the units conversion using Avogadro's number and all that, you can get it to about 1.39 mils O2 per per gram of hemoglobin, per gram of hemoglobin. That's the oxygen carrying capacity of human hemoglobin. Great, so that's how much per gram hemoglobin you can carry. That's the oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin. And the average person maybe have 12 to 18 grams hemoglobin per deciliter of blood. A deciliter is 100 mLs of blood, right? It's the same difference. So anyways, that's an average concentration that can be measured. So there's different ways you can assess a person's oxygen carrying capacity. Well, one is by measuring directly the hemoglobin. That's the normal range. Another quicker way is just look at the proportion of RBCs to whole blood. That's called a hematocrit determination. So hematocrit, or just crit for short, or just HCT for short, I mean, I've seen all of those. It's determining the proportion of RBCs to whole blood. That's what's important. So what you can do is, in your little capillary, I have one British professor who kept saying and calling it capillary. They say capillary. And ever since then, I keep calling it capillary. So if I say it, just go with it. Capillary, same thing. Yeah. So the top portion is our plasma, right? The liquid portion. The yellow portion, I won't color it too thoroughly, but you get the idea. And you got your buffy coat, and you get the red stuff, the RBCs. All down there. And what you can do is just measure the top mark. Remember, the top mark doesn't matter. It's the proportions that matter. Just use the top mark to figure out what the whole is. So I think I bracketed it and called it Y. And then just kind of figure out the proportion of X. As long as X is about 37 to 54%, then that's considered normal. This is the normal range. So below 37, you may be anemic, slightly anemic. Above 54, that's considered polycythemia. Those terms are at the bottom there. So the other thing you can do to determine the hemoglobin concentration, I mean, it should kind of go hand in hand. If crit's low, probably hemoglobin's low too. Maybe those red blood cells pack lower than 37% because they're smaller, so it means they're poorly hemoglobinized, as they call it. If you're kind of like healthy, normal person, say male or female, I used to kind of assign an activity from the physiologics. I don't do that anymore. I just kind of talk over it now. If you're kind of a healthy male, you weigh a little bit more. So say on average it's 14 to 18 grams of hemoglobin per deciliter of blood. Those are always the units. So maybe a female on average weighs a little bit less. So maybe 12 to 16 is their normal range. If you're anemic, maybe your value is 9. If you have polycythemia, maybe the number's 20. I mean, the point is, if you know the normal range, you should be able to kind of ascertain or predict what may be outside the normal range. Training has the effect of increasing the concentration. So maybe a female athlete would be higher. Maybe it would be really high, and it'd be interesting to look up some of the highest values you can measure. what I think you should be expected to do is, can you tell if it wasn't labeled, which one's anemic, which one's polycythemic? It's easy to tell, of course, when it's labeled, but if you see the density of RBCs lower, there's more space between cells, that's anemia. They're all packed. I don't even see any space between cells here. And also the morphology of the cell is abnormal. They're puckered and sickled. This happens to be sickle cell anemia. There are other kinds. Let's go through the different types of anemias, different causes of anemias. Anemia means low blood. Anemia, sorry, let's spell that. Anemia means low blood. You could just be bleeding, blood loss, obviously. That causes low blood loss. Whether it's acute or chronic, like a slow bleeding ulcer or an acute stab wound. Nutritional, there's different kinds there. Lack of iron or folic acid. I'll just go with iron, it's a common one. A pernicious anemia is a lack of B12. Lack of B12. Because you need B12 to help absorb iron from the diet. However, there's also in the elderly a problem called a lack of intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is produced by the mucosa of the gut. And in the elderly, as your stomach kind of shrivels, you can take in less food. Well, there might be a lack of intrinsic factor. And if you have a lack of intrinsic factor, that helps to get B12. And then you need B12 to get the iron. So they're all kind of connected. The end result is low iron. And if you have an iron deficient anemia, it kind of looks like that on the left. I know it's hard to see, it's kind of a lower mag 400, but I mean, what you should see closer up from a textbook is the cells on the right represent iron deficient anemia. You see how the center is more translucent? They call that hypochromic. They're less colorful. Iron deficient anemia. Cells, well, specifically the RBCs, right, are hypochromic. They're less chromatic, they're less colorful because they're like clear in the middle, more so than regular cells. That means they have low HB and they're probably smaller. So the diameter is less than 7 microns. They're under the normal range. Here's a picture I took from our set of slides, and I pointed to a few micro-sized. That's what you call cells that are, well, obviously they're small, right? They're micro. So they're hypochromic, they're called quote-unquote micro. Small cells. There are some genetic forms that can be inherited. You can correct iron deficient anemia. You can take iron supplements. You can just eat collard greens, the leafy green vegetables. And some whole grains. Oh, I saw on TV once this lady, she had this magnet and she had this like bag of like oatmeal or something and the dry oats, and she just stroked the iron with the magnet, right? out of the oats, and I have never been able to do that. I saw her do it, it's pretty amazing. There's iron in our food. So that can correct iron deficient anemia, but that will not correct some of these genetic causes of anemia. So you got the sickle cell anemia. There is a single amino acid mutation that causes the whole RBC to pucker or sickle. A single amino acid mutation causes RBC to pucker or sickle. I have a better picture of it later showing you the mutation. When this mutation was passed on through the generations, in parts of the world where it conferred protection against the malaria parasite. So it conferred a benefit because that could kill you. However, it's a severe anemia. And if you have the trait, you can be treated with blood transfusions or you can be cured with a bone marrow transplant. The other form is a thalassemia anemia. This is one where you inherit a faulty gene. That's either defective for the alpha or the beta chain. Okay, so you inherit two for alpha, two for beta, one from each parent. I'm saying if one is faulty from either parent, that's the minor. If you inherit two bad of the same one, well, that's major and you usually don't survive. Okay. So it's a faulty alpha or beta chain, so you're gonna like have half the amount. That would cause that form of anemia. Maybe your crit's in the low 30s. Here's a picture of the sickle cell anemia, and it's easy to see from this picture how a cell, normal shaped top, puckered shaped bottom, all because of a single amino acid mutation, okay, causing the sickle appearance. So at the other end of the spectrum, anemia, you have polycythemia. Now you don't have to know these numbers here, but know there is kind of a secondary versus severe polycythemia. You worry about too much being a bad thing because blood can get too viscous and goopy and cause spontaneous strokes. Because if blood stops circulating, you allow the clotting factors to accumulate and you get all these spontaneous blood clots. So it is dangerous. But this is kind of safer. People who live in high altitudes will have it. Because what's happening when you drive up the mountain, you're getting less oxygen per breath because there's less atmosphere above you. So the barometric pressure is getting less, which means you're getting less per breath, less O2 per breath. That creates hypoxia. And what that could do, well, here's the numbers. Barometric pressure decreases, creates hypoxic environment in your body. With each increase of 1,000 feet elevation, your max O2 consumption decreases about 3%. So you acclimatize, you adapt after a few days of exposure to altitude. So after 1 to 3 days exposure, everything that it occurs is to improve the oxygen transport that was deficient when you got high in the mountain ranges. So decreased, so this change here, this decreased plasma volume, you're not decreasing plasma volume. What you're doing is you're increasing your crit. So because the proportion is changing, by default, you're decreasing the plasma. So normal normal hemoglobin concentration, it can nearly double. Okay. Increased pulmonary vascularity, you're basically better perfusing the lungs with blood for better O2 pickup. And then for the muscles, you improve muscle vascularity to improve oxygen transport for the muscle. And physiology is shown here, this process of acclimatization, well, particularly for increasing the blood. All right, so the stimulus is, say you drive up to Lake Tahoe, and then you drive up in your jogging outfit, and you get out of the car, you go on a run. You don't have time to acclimatize, right? So that's going to be out of breath. Hypoxia. Okay, well. The kidney releases erythropoietin, EPO. It's going to target the bone marrow. That's why they show proximal femur there. The bone marrow, in response to EPO, put that in parentheses, what it's going to do is it's going to increase your CRIT, your red blood cells. And that will correct hypoxia. So EPO is essential for this process. In fact, it has been shown that without EPO, you will not correct hypoxia. So it's essential. You need the erythropoietin to acclimatize. Now, as a side topic, there's artificial blood doping that athletes typically do to get a boost. Just to show you the importance of the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. If you need more of it for your athletic event, something called autologous blood doping is where the athlete, again, this is illegal, most sports, most federations, particularly cyclists have it's big in cycling, big problem for cycling. During the training, months before competition, you take a few pints of your blood and you store it, you freeze it. Now it's your own blood, you train, and the day before the event, or maybe even during the event, you just go off, I don't know, maybe it's like the Tour de France and you stay overnight, you get your blood out, and you drop a bag of blood on yourself, it's illegal, and well, you're giving yourself a boost, right? It works, I mean, you have an increase in performance. So look at that timeline. Remove the blood prior to the event, during training. The training will get your blood back to your baseline, whatever it is. And then right at your event, give yourself a boost. And so it's hard to catch if it's your own blood. Unless you measured here and here. Like, wait a minute, how did you have this much of a jump in a couple of days? There is synthetic EPO. That's how Lance Armstrong got caught. I mean, I remember reading this report when it came out many years ago. And he really went out of his way to cheat and beat his odds. It's too bad. It smeared his name. He did so much for testicular cancer awareness. I mean, but it worked. He won the Tour de France 7 times. Not anymore. They took those away, right?
Yeah.
Gone. Which that was the right thing to do. The guy before him, Greg LeMond, you guys remember him? You guys are too young. He was the guy who did it right. He was one of the last guys in the early 80s. He won Tour de France 3 times. The only American to do that. He was clean. Okay, when guys like him came along, guys like Greg LeMond could not compete. Okay? There was even one Tour de France where Greg LeMond, he had to drop out. He was going to compete with the cheaters. Okay? And it's not bad to call them that. It's really a problem for the sport if the top athletes can't compete because you're doing it. So it's a problem for certain sports. I remember in the '84 Olympics, it came out that the U.S. cycling team had a problem with it. And they weren't even doing autologous. They were just using other family members' blood, and that caused a lot of problems for them health-wise. So saving your own blood is good if you're having a surgery and you kind of need it in case something goes wrong with the surgery, you need your own blood for a surgical procedure. But for athletic events, that's a big no-no, basically. I'll stop here. I want to give us a break, and when we come back, we'll have time to study the models.